Okay, thanks very much. And first begin with an apology. I'm sort of deeply shamed at being the first person to use PowerPoint, but you'll forgive me if I say that I am a sociologist, so that's part of the explanation. So there's a bit of vulgar sociology amongst a lot of humanities who, I think don't tend to use PowerPoint. Also going to say some things that have, go back over things that we've already discussed inevitably at the end of an event like this, which I've found, enormously valuable. And, I don't hesitate to say one of the best events of this kind I've attended over the last couple of years. So thanks, to the organisers. And by the organisers, I don't mean the sponsors. I mean the people who organised it at Brighton. So I'm going to, the issue of trajectories was raised. So I will say what the trajectory of higher education in the UK has been. It's from a social democratic to a neoliberal knowledge regime. That's Robbins, I'm going to suggest, is a social democratic approach to higher education. The Brown Report, strongly neoliberal. That's from a knowledge society, that is the idea of the university in relation to society, to a global knowledge economy and the university functioning for economic rather than social purposes. When the idea, the more expansive idea of the university was being set out in the 60s, Clark Kerr referred to the university as a multiversity to indicate its multiple functions. I think what we're now witnessing is a monoversity, a sort of monoculture of the university under a neoliberal regime. And that involves the unbundling of the previous functions of the university. Unbundling comes from a recent intervention by Sir Michael Barber, the architect of something called deliverology. And what deliverology does is a process of identifying those aspects of an organization that can be separated out and marketized and dealt with separately. And he's the head of Pearson Higher Education and, of course, was on the Brown Review. So you see a situation there. And I think in Robbins, absolutely very strongly in Robbins, what was being articulated was higher education as part of a national system. But now we think of universities as global corporations, and what counts is each institution's place in a global rank order. And that's what I'm going to call as, those features of the current, what I say are going to suggest are intrinsic to a neoliberal regime. And it's possible, that people have mentioned that there have been incremental changes, and now the changes seem to be much more rapid. The possibility of rapid change has derived from the very success of Robbins in producing a national system. So although we have introduced Americanized features, we are far beyond the American model. So we can see in the American model some of the negative aspects of what is happening, but we have now taken the American model and produced it. So just as Kerr had a California model of the California Master Plan, which was a niche social democratic, we're now a niche American state operating the full Americanized neoliberal model. What I'm going to say, what Robbins did was inaugurate mass higher education and its public benefits, and just set out that it was a principled approach, and there were 4 public benefits identified. Higher education available to all those qualified by ability and attainment to pursue them. To serve a public benefit of a skilled and educated workforce. That's a continual element, the issue of employment. It isn't a negative thing that our universities provide an education which people find useful. It would be pretty mad if they didn't. But that utility is not the only benefit, it's not the primary one. So he also refers to the public benefit of higher education in producing cultivated men and women, forgive his slightly archaic representation, the public benefit of securing the advancement of learning through the combination of teaching and research within institutions. The idea of the university was in both those aspects, not teaching only institutions, research predominant university. And the public benefit of providing a common culture and standards of citizenship. So it was, again, a 1960s idea of democracy, but nonetheless an idea of democracy as central. And I call it a social democratic knowledge regime, even though I sense Robbins spinning in his final resting place, because he was a liberal economist. But it's a social democratic knowledge regime because it sets out an inclusive public interest in higher education. That is, it's not an interest of some people and not others. Everybody has an interest in it. And their interest in it is precisely an interest in a national system of higher education. And education is being expressed as a social right underpinning democratic inclusion. It's associated with economic growth, but it's associated with economic growth in the context of a secular decline in inequalities, which goes from the mid-1930s to the early 1980s and is in turn associated with the expansion of the welfare state. So this is the high point of social amelioration, of the address of inequality, and Britain is at its most equal in the process of the production of the public university that Robbins sets out. And it's also the moment when social scientific knowledge in particular is being linked to this project of democratization. So it's significant that shortly after Robbins, and from the social science perspective, the Social Science Research Council is formed. So it's not simply teaching, but also research is being linked to what I would call an expansive idea of knowledge and its relation to society, not knowledge and its relation to the economy. The Brown Report, putting the market at the heart of the system, it's the only major engagement with HE since the 1960s to make no reference to public benefits, nor, insofar as there's slight recognition of them, how they might be secured after marketization. All you have is education as a private investment in human capital by students, brackets, and their families. And that's the standard Thatcherite. There's no such thing as society, only individuals and their families. The contribution of universities to economic growth is emphasized. One could say economic growth could be conceptualized as a wider public benefit, but it's also a benefit to private companies, and now it's to be funded by student fees alone. Brown rejects corporation tax, and he's rejecting public benefits of higher education. And he can't make any statement about the public benefits of higher education, because were he to do so, he would legitimate the public funding of higher education. And then the question that sometimes gets asked, was the system broken? It's a really good report for the European Union by Orbin et al. They identify the UK higher education as a system. This is not looking at individual institutions, but looking at the characteristics of higher education, all its institutions taken together. And the British system is judged in the comparisons across OECD countries as providing the best research, the best teaching outcomes, and the best value for money. So the system is emphatically not broken. If we were in a time of evidence-based policy, we would be recommending British higher education as a model for the development of public higher education and meeting those needs. The aim instead is global higher education and the position of individual institution in an international rank order of higher education institutions. And as Howard Hudson has pointed out in other publica dealing with rank orders, the institutions which are identified as globally significant are institutions that serve very few students, and the students they serve are the students of elite social backgrounds. And those institutions are not oriented to local needs. So insofar as there's still going to be a public cost to supporting student loans and so on, the public is now supporting a system that doesn't provide public benefit, but provides private benefits. So this is an extraordinary outcome. So what is a neoliberal knowledge regime? And had a bit of discussion about that, whether it was over. I think that the neoliberal knowledge regime is a strange thing because it's based upon the idea of creating a frictionless present. So when Will Hutton referred to the idea, what will our community look like in 20 years' time? That is what we should think of. What a neoliberal idea is about discounting everything to calculate everything so you can bring into the present the costs of the future. That's what derivatives were about. That's what all the financial instruments about. It has failed because one cannot think of the economy in terms of a frictionless present. But in terms of substantively how that figures in higher education, research is valued for its contribution to economic growth and the extent to which it's commodified. Loosely, that's the impact agenda. Education as an investment in human capital. The stratification of universities and the creation of a new elite of resource-rich, research-intensive universities and resource-poor teaching-only institutions. That's very clear that is emerging. Entry of for-profit providers, including and especially multinational corporations. That's the Pearson model, and they've got massive resources. Pearson have more resources than the entire English higher education system. That's what we're up against. And of course, freeing universities to pursue for-profit activities and to seek for-profit partners. This is not like Oxford University Press, generating a profit through publishing and returning the profit to the university to pursue its purpose. This is putting a hypodermic needle into the university, drawing profit out and providing it to shareholders in outsourced companies. So that's the regime. Its social correlates, or societal correlates, as I said, we've moved from the idea of a knowledge society to the knowledge economy. The knowledge economy does not deliver for our population. It's not an inclusive project. Higher education is now the engine of widening inequality, not its amelioration. One could speak of the amelioration of inequality and education's role in it. Now we cannot do so. We are now in the top 10 of the most unequal countries in the world, in Britain. The emphasis is about low aspirations and encouraging social mobility into selective universities. But 27% of our young people live in poverty, and they are now cast as undeserving of having that poverty relieved because it's an obligation upon themselves to relieve it for themselves by having better aspirations. All the evidence on social mobility shows that by addressing poverty, you address social mobility. By reducing the distance between positions, you make social mobility more easy. But there's also a generational inequality, a shift in the burdens of costs of education from current taxpayers onto the young through fees, and of future taxpayers because of the costs of the loan system. And the future taxpayers are our current graduates who face a double burden, the burden of indebtedness and the burden of responsibility of for the costs of the system. And that has a very specific purpose. The aim is to lock in taxpayer rejection of public spending. And towards the end, I'm going to show you how the current graduates, doubly indebted, will start to be the advocates of the further dismantling of public higher education, unless we stop it. So anyway, that's inequality. So the first part of it, as you see, up until about 1970, you see falling inequality. And you see that the UK is one of the most equal societies amongst the four compared here, US, UK, Germany, and France. And then it rises dramatically from the 1970s onwards. And it's that rise that we have not thought through of its significance for higher education, as if it's happening outside the university. Now we are having to address what it is to be a university in a context of inequality and in a context where the policies towards the university are the policies towards the deepening of inequality. But what are public attitudes? This came back, you know, and so I say, well, before the Brown Review, and the Brown Review did some research. It never reported the research it did on public attitudes. It's an outrage that it did the research, because why did they waste the money doing research when the British Social Attitudes Survey had asked the same questions? So it was an ignorant process. They never reported them, and they didn't report them because they found exactly this. 65% thought tuition fees should be the same across all universities. 70% thought there were more advantages to a university education than simply being paid more. Employability was not the primary concern. 75% thought costs of going to university left students with debts they couldn't afford to pay. That's before the introduction of the new regime. 80% thought children from better off families have more advantages than children from less well-off families. And just 27% thought people in Britain have similar opportunities regardless of income. We don't have to persuade the public about very much because they're... And why should those who don't go to university pay? That's a question that was posed in the Brown Review. One of the other things that happened strikingly as a consequence of the success of the Robbins model as it's developed is the aspiration to university has been universalized. There isn't a problem of aspirations, there's a problem of opportunities, and there's a problem of alienation and sense that those opportunities will not be provided, and so an adjustment of expectations. 98% of mothers of small children wish their child to go to university. That's an extraordinary figure. But the fall in support since the introduction of the new regime is greatest amongst those with qualifications. Among those with graduate-level qualifications, now 42% support the idea that students should pay for the costs of higher education. These are all people who did not pay for the costs of higher education, just so we're absolutely clear. Right? While 30% believe there should be a reduction in the numbers studying at university. Amongst those without qualifications, those that David Willits is concerned about, why should they pay? Only 11% support the idea that students should pay for the costs of higher education, and only 19% believe there should be a reduction in student numbers. The reason why these data matter, and we should be really focused on them, is that as students go through, Million Plus has just done a report with London Economics arguing for a progressive graduate tax. That is because there are people who are going to earn significantly more than the 21,000 threshold. The problem is that those who earn significantly more than the £21,000 threshold have an interest in the threshold being reduced, because then they won't have to pay for the costs of other people who don't meet the threshold. And that's the lock-in, and that's the lock-in there. And you already see, and I think it's absolutely disingenuous of Vice Chancellors and disingenuous of Will Hutton to say somehow that the threshold of 21,000 is progressive, because we know the threshold of 21,000 will be lowered, and we know that there is an argument for lowering it and an argument for being put forward for removing the fee cap. And so what I'll say just about those arguments, if Million Plus and London Economics show the force of the idea of a progressive graduate tax, it quite simply shows much more the force of the idea of progressive taxation, where the generation who benefited from free education with higher incomes should, in a sense, pay for the generation that comes after them. That's what I would mean by saying that what neoliberalism does is break the generational contract. And it breaks the generational contract precisely because of its belief in the frictionless present. There is no future different from the present. And so what we get is the emergence of education as a positional good, and that will be achieved most strongly by attendance in the bundled elite university, the one that Pearson doesn't dismantle and redistribute its parts. And this is an attack on publics. It's an attack on democracies. So when I said, well, we shouldn't be posing the state versus the market, we should be posing the market versus publics. And what is the idea of a public? A public is brought into being by dialogue. And we have to think of politics as being the representation of publics. The market is not dialogical. It's based on the individual as a consumer, same way that the student is represented as a consumer, and individuals make self-referential choices which the market aggregates. So where the more markets replace public functions, what they're really replacing is publics, and what they're replacing is the capacity to engage in dialogue. The reduction of the publics to the markets then, I would say, is anti-democratic. But well, sorry, I forgot this. I've got the wrong slide. It's not the functions of sociology it replaces. Whoops. It undermines the function of the universe. It's no accident that universities are being marketized. If we were going to say, what could we generalize as the idea of the university that we've discovered over these 2 days? The thing that unites us all is a belief in the university as a space for debate, a space for dialogue, a space for contestation, a space for the imagining of the possibility of a society that should be different, a space for the imagining of a future against an ideology which makes everything the continuous present.